This is my story. A story of how my husband's best friend crossed the ultimate line, and how the consequences of one night's passion spiraled into a web of lies, guilt, and revenge. The night was heavy with tension, and as the moonlight spilled through the bedroom curtains, it illuminated a truth that had been festering for months. My marriage had long been on the rocks. The affection between my husband and me had dwindled to a mere shadow of what it once was. But what unfolded one fateful night shattered the last remnants of our bond, and oddly, I found myself feeling no regret. The unspoken distance. It all began when my husband's best friend, Mark, started spending more time at our house. What initially seemed like casual visits gradually became frequent, almost too frequent. My husband seemed to relish Mark's company, and it was clear they shared a bond that had stood the test of time. However, with every visit, I could sense a growing distance between my husband and me, and an unexpected tension between Mark and me. Mark had always been kind, respectful, and perhaps a little too attentive. His lingering glances, the way he would brush against me accidentally, and the moments when our eyes met for a little longer than usual, all these were signals I tried to ignore. But deep down, I knew there was an unspoken connection simmering beneath the surface. The unexpected proposal. One evening, as we sat together in the dimly lit living room after my husband had retired early to bed, Mark leaned in closer. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, as he confessed that he had always admired me, that he couldn't help but notice the growing rift between my husband and me. I was taken aback, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. Mark's words were intoxicating, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored the emptiness I felt in my marriage. Before I could process his confession, he proposed something that left me breathless. He wanted to help me find the passion I had lost, to reignite the flame that had long been extinguished in my life. He wanted to do it right there, in the bed I shared with my husband. Crossing the line, I was frozen, caught between moral conflict and the undeniable attraction I felt towards Mark. But in that moment, the weight of my failing marriage, my husband's neglect, and the loneliness that had consumed me made the decision for me. I nodded, almost imperceptibly, and that was all the invitation Mark needed. What followed was a blur of passion, guilt, and euphoria. Mark was gentle yet assertive, his touch igniting a fire within me that I hadn't felt in years. It was forbidden, reckless, and undeniably exhilarating. As he moved behind me, I felt a sense of power I hadn't felt in a long time, like I was reclaiming a part of myself that had been lost. Every thrust was a reminder of what I had been missing. Every whisper in my ear an affirmation of my desire. It was a betrayal, yes, but one that felt justified, necessary even. And as I lay there afterward, wrapped in the warmth of our shared sin, I realized I felt no regret. The aftermath. The next morning, I awoke with a strange sense of calm. Mark had left before dawn, leaving no trace of what had transpired the night before. My husband was oblivious, his usual self as he sipped his coffee and read the newspaper. But I was different. The guilt I expected never came. Instead, there was a sense of liberation, as if I had finally taken control of my life. Days turned into weeks, and while Mark and I never spoke of that night again, the experience lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the boundaries I had crossed and the unexpected satisfaction it had brought me. My marriage continued to deteriorate, but I no longer cared. I had found something that made me feel alive again, even if it was fleeting. The silent struggle. Days after that night, life returned to an unsettling normal. My husband remained oblivious, caught up in his world, and Mark resumed his friendly visits, though there was an underlying tension every time we locked eyes. I was constantly on edge, the guilt slowly gnawing at the edges of my conscience. Yet I was also drawn to the thrill of what had happened. There were moments when I questioned my decisions, wondering if I should confront my husband, confess what had happened, or at least talk to Mark about what it all meant. But the fear of breaking everything down kept me silent. The struggle within me was real, a tug of war between guilt and a newfound sense of empowerment. It was like walking a tightrope, with one misstep threatening to plunge me into chaos. The forbidden encounter. As time passed, the tension between Mark and me became unbearable. We both knew that the night in our matrimonial bed wasn't just a one-time lapse of judgment. It was the beginning of something dangerous, something we couldn't easily walk away from. One evening, when my husband was out of town on a business trip, Mark showed up at our door. I knew why he was there, and I knew that if I let him in, there would be no going back. But the magnetic pull between us was too strong to resist. I opened the door, and with it, I opened myself up to a world of secrecy and forbidden desire. The encounter that night was even more intense, fueled by the knowledge of our shared sin and the danger of getting caught. We were like addicts, unable to resist the lure of the forbidden. It was passionate, raw, and completely reckless. And yet, in the midst of it all, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, a feeling of finally taking control of my desires, even if it meant betraying my husband once again. The unraveling. The affair with Mark continued, each encounter more dangerous than the last. We were playing with fire, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we got burned. The guilt was becoming harder to suppress, and my husband, though still oblivious, began to notice changes in me, my distant behavior, my lack of interest in our marriage, and the way I seemed to light up whenever Mark was around. One evening, after yet another secret rendezvous with Mark, I returned home to find my husband waiting for me. His face was a mask of suspicion and hurt. He didn't have any concrete evidence, but his instincts told him something was wrong. The confrontation was brutal. He accused me of being distant, of hiding something, and I could see the cracks in our marriage widening with each word. I denied everything, of course, but the guilt was written all over my face. My husband didn't press further that night, but the damage was done. Our marriage was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The moment of truth. The day of reckoning came sooner than I expected. My husband had gone through my phone and found incriminating messages between Mark and me. He confronted me with the evidence, his face twisted in anger and betrayal. There was no point in denying it anymore. I was caught, and the truth was out. The confrontation was explosive. My husband demanded to know how long it had been going on, how many times I had betrayed him, and why I had done it. I tried to explain, to make him understand the loneliness and neglect I had felt. But it only made things worse. The man I had once loved was now my enemy, and there was no going back. In a fit of rage, my husband threw me out of the house. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, except Mark. But even as I drove to his place, I knew that what we had wasn't love. It was lust, betrayal, and the thrill of the forbidden. And now, with everything out in the open, the excitement was gone, replaced by a cold, hard reality. The consequences. Living with Mark was far from the fantasy I had imagined. Without the secrecy and thrill of our forbidden affair, our relationship quickly began to deteriorate. The passion that had once burned so brightly between us was now a flickering flame, barely sustained by the remnants of our lust. Mark, once attentive and caring, became distant and irritable. He blamed me for the mess we were in, for the destruction of our friendship with my husband. The guilt, once suppressed by the excitement of the affair, now consumed me. I had destroyed my marriage, my husband's trust, and even my relationship with Mark. All for what? Meanwhile, my husband had filed for divorce, and the legal battle that ensued was brutal. He wanted everything: the house, the money, even custody of our children. I fought back, but my heart wasn't in it. I was too drained, too broken to care about material things. The only thing I had left was the hollow shell of a relationship with Mark, and even that was crumbling. The price of betrayal. In the end, I lost everything. My marriage, my home, my reputation. It was all gone. Mark and I eventually broke up, unable to sustain a relationship built on betrayal and deceit. I was left alone, haunted by the choices I had made, the lines I had crossed. But even in the depths of my despair, there was a part of me that felt no regret. I had followed my desires, taken control of my life in a way I never had before. It had cost me everything, but it had also given me something invaluable: a hard-won sense of self-awareness, of understanding my own flaws and the consequences of my actions. Now, as I look back on those tumultuous years, I see them for what they were: a cautionary tale of lust, betrayal, and the high price of crossing boundaries. I've learned that the thrill of the forbidden comes at a steep cost, and the consequences are rarely worth the fleeting pleasure. But most of all, I've learned that true power comes not from following your darkest desires, but from knowing when to walk away.